Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking the absolutely incredible story of a nation that took absolute vulnerability and somehow reverse engineered it into a global economic superpower. If you love figuring out how systems, geography, and sheer historical necessity collide to create something totally unprecedented, well, you are definitely in the right place. We're going to map out Singapore's journey using its exact survival blueprint.
So, here's the million-dollar question. How on earth did a small island, one characterized historically by swamps and a complete, absolute lack of natural resources, literally no minerals or primary goods to export, how did it become the richest nation in the Asia-Pacific by the early 21st century? It's a massive contrast. The sources we're looking at today reveal that this definitely wasn't an accident. It was a highly engineered survival mechanism.
To really understand this, we have to start with one specific year, 1965. And look, this wasn't some joyous, carefully planned out liberation. No way. This was the year Singapore was thrust into an unwanted, honestly terrifying independence. Driven by deep political and ethnic differences, Singapore was officially separated from the Federation of Malaysia. Suddenly, they were entirely on their own, staring down severe unemployment, a shrinking GDP, and a massive budgetary deficit.
The stakes here were just astronomically high. Picture this. Following just a one-hour radio broadcast announcing their expulsion from Malaysia, the reality of the situation set in. Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew and his government were essentially under attack by a former partner. They were an island with no hinterland, suddenly stripped of their expected economic network, and completely vulnerable. Survival? Yeah, it was absolutely not guaranteed.
Section 1. The Lion City Awakens, from myth to a strategic colonial outpost.
Let's do a super quick jump through history. In 1299, we've got the founding myth, where Prince Songnila Utama spots what he thinks is a lion and names the island Singapura, or Lion City. Fast forward to 1819, and Sir Stamford Raffles shows up, recognizes the island's killer advantage as a free port, and sets up a British trading post. But then we hit 1942, when the Japanese invade, totally shattering the British order. Basically, for centuries, Singapore was largely treated like a pawn, valued strictly for its location by whatever empire happened to be sailing by. And that brings us to a really crucial concept: entrepot. This is the foundational economic DNA of the island. Remember earlier when I said they had no natural resources? Well, what they did have was a deepwater harbor sitting right at the entrance to the Straits of Malacca. They didn't produce the goods. Instead, they processed and transshipped the goods of nearby lands, stuff like rubber and tin from the Malay Peninsula. They essentially leveraged their geography to make up for their lack of stuff.
Section 2. War and Sudden Independence, the crucible of modern Singapore.
For the longest time, the British had hyped up Singapore as this impregnable fortress, but the 1942 Japanese occupation destroyed that myth in just 7 days. The occupation brought a horrific reign of terror, massacres, famine, and rampant disease. It was brutal. And the local population learned a very harsh lesson from this. They could not rely on the British, or anyone else for that matter, for protection. This profound historical trauma instilled a deep-seated, totally uncompromising need for self-reliance in Singapore's future leaders.
So by the time 1965 rolls around, expectations were, frankly, pretty grim, but the reality became a stark contrast. By treating independence not as some triumphant victory, but as a desperate struggle for basic survival, the first generation of leaders managed to curb unemployment, drastically raise living standards, and roll out mass housing. So how exactly did they bridge the gap between that terrifying expectation and this miraculous reality?
Section 3. The Survival Blueprint. Drastic engineering for a vulnerable nation.
The sheer scale of their action plan was literally unprecedented. They knew they couldn't just rely on trade anymore. So they established the Jurong Industrial Estate to basically jumpstart manufacturing from scratch. They created the Housing Development Board, or HDB, to solve a massive squatter and sanitation crisis. They enforced mass education to build a highly capable workforce, and they aggressively reformed all their decaying infrastructure. This was top-down, rapid-fire social and economic engineering on a massive scale.
Now, as our sources point out, all this engineering came with a very specific political reality under the ruling People's Action Party, or PAP. On one hand, you have these massive economic successes, achieving Asian tiger status, building world-class housing, and creating a famously clean, corruption-free society. But these were balanced by strict political controls. The sources detail how the government used the Internal Security Act for detentions without trial, implemented censorship of traditional media, and utilized an electoral system with gerrymandering to make it incredibly difficult for opposition parties.
The sources present this as a tightly controlled environment, explicitly designed by the leadership to eliminate the political chaos they saw in the 1950s and 60s.
Section 4. Engineering and Economic Miracle. From transshipping to high-tech finance.
So how exactly did they evolve from a simple transshipping port to what they are today? The sources lay out a really clear step-by-step evolution. Step 1 was their historical role, processing stuff like rubber and tin. But Step 2, that was the post-1965 pivot. The government actively called on foreign multinational industries to come in and invest, offering financing and guarantees to stimulate growth. And once they had that capital and a newly trained workforce, they moved right into Step 3, becoming a leading international business hub and developing a high-tech global financial exchange, the SGX.
There's a really fascinating conceptual shift here. Singapore recognized that physical trade routes, moving actual boats through the Straits of Malacca, had strict limits. So, what do? They overcame those physical constraints by transforming themselves into a digital hub. They were early adopters of computerization in the telecom sector. Their modern digital reality as a financial and data hub actually mirrors their historical role as a physical trading port perfectly. Think about it. They are still an entrepot. They're just moving data and capital now instead of spices and rubber.
Section 5. A multi-narrative society. Multiculturalism as a survival tool.
But here's the thing. An economic miracle doesn't mean much if the society tears itself apart from the inside. Singapore is this complex patchwork of disparate nationalities and cultures: Chinese, Malay, Indian, Eurasian. To keep all that stable, the government solution was to actively forge a brand new national identity using two primary unifiers. First, they pushed the English language, creating a common ground that didn't automatically favor any single native ethnic group's language. Second, the shared goal of market capitalism. The overarching idea was that a highly successful, technocratic nation would provide the necessary glue to hold all these different diasporas together. So the crucial takeaway here is that this multiculturalism wasn't just left to happen on its own. It was a strict, highly managed framework. The state actively led integration policies. For example, they instituted locality-based housing quotas in those HDB flats we talked about, actually ensuring that different ethnicities lived right next door to each other to prevent ethnic enclaves from forming. They used mandatory, state-funded education to instill national values, constantly, carefully managing the tension between distinct ethnic identities and a unified, local Singaporean identity.
Our sources describe the end result of all this as a plural monoculture, which is such an interesting concept. Singapore is multi in its cultural identities. They honor different heritages, diverse foods, various holidays, but it is absolutely mono when it comes to the strict civil framework of legal citizenship. Everyone, regardless of background, operates within the exact same highly regulated container of the state.
Which really leads us to one massive, critical question to end on. Singapore turned total vulnerability into immense wealth through sheer, tightly managed engineering. But as globalization shifts today, as brand new threats like climate change and global economic slowdowns emerge, how is this highly controlled, highly engineered identity going to evolve next? Can a system specifically designed for 20th century survival maintain its razor-sharp edge in the 21st century? It's definitely something to chew on. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. I hope the structural view helped map out the incredible history of Singapore for you. Keep learning, and I'll see you next time.